So good morning, my name is Marcy Atwood. I'm Air Force, and after Air Force I was a consultant in the Department of Defense, and currently I'm a federal employee for the Department of the Air Force, and I support the Air Force Memorial in Washington, D.C. I'm your moderator today, and what the people we have speaking are, as you see on the screen, we have Barb Rumi, who is a pilot, Air Force, and was an airline pilot as well. Trish Beckman, who is Navy, a navigator or a naval flight officer, as they say in the Navy, and a test flight engineer. And we have Kelly Hamilton down here in the corner, who is an Air Force officer pilot and was an airline pilot as well. And in front of you, we have three more, starting on the far side over there. Diana Davis is Army helicopter pilot, and then continued after her career with financial management. And we have Peggy Phillips in the middle, who is Air Force?
So retired Air Force.
Retired Air Force pilot, and also airline. Right?
No
No?
airline.
No, sorry.
Just a mom.
Just a mom. And then we have Lucy Young, who is Navy pilot and a reserve, I believe, retired out of the reserves, and an airline pilot. And we are here to tell you stories about the WASP. And we can do that because the WASP, after they got their veterans' rights, and then they were talking about, all these young women gonna get to fly airplanes in the military again. They stood up a nonprofit organization, kind of a follow-on to the WASP. It was called the Women Military Pilots Association. And they stood this thing up and they managed it and ran it for a couple of years before they invited us to join. And they did it, I think, because they knew what we were going to be facing. So they wanted to kind of help us. So they became our mentors. They became our moms. They became our advisors. And they would slap us silly if we were doing something silly, something not right, or crying too much. They would just slap us silly and tell us, get back in there and keep fighting. So we want to talk about those people we knew after they did the WASP thing. They've told us stories that maybe other people haven't heard, and we knew them when they were starting in their early 60s. And now we are past our early 60s and want to tell the stories of these WASPs. So I'll start because I remember, and I can't remember whose knee I was sitting on the floor listening, but remember last night where Lisa was saying you had to have the red lipstick on when you got out of the airplane? Well, a couple of gals say, aviators are very inventive. And Jackie Cochran was very strict about how you looked when you got out of the cockpit. And she really wanted our blouses to be pressed. And when you fly in Texas in the summer, it's a little bit hot, and you get sweaty and wrinkly. So they would get in their airplanes, do the pre-flight, taxi out to the end of the runway, then make up an excuse with the tower and say, oh, I got to do an engine run or a check. They would take their blouse off, hang it up behind them on the seat, on a hanger, go fly the mission, land, taxi to the end of the runway, and make an excuse with tower and say, oh, I got a problem here, I gotta check something. And they would put their blouse back on, it would be nice.
Not only that, they would carry a skirt in their map case, because when they got to the O Club, they were required to put on a skirt.
So I would like to start with Barb Rumi. Yes, please, Barb, can you tell us how you met the WASP and what was the first time you met them and what you can tell us about them? And I will remind everybody, keep your comments as short as possible because we've got a lot to talk about. Go ahead, Barb, you've got a hot mic.
I'm trying to do it. This is a Women's Military Pilots Association, and this is a letter for 1988, and this is letter due to the need for the pilots in World War II, women pilots were called upon to serve, whether not or military clearance. We had initially women were required to have 500 flying hours. And I had this letter, and it says that, you know, they have to have 6 months trainings, and then this 1,074 women pilots graduated to this place. And that, the general, Hap Arnold, indicted is to make the WASP, the Air Corps, when presented for approval. This became a political one, and the WASP were denied. Now take that, Kelly. You know more.
Oh. Thank
Sorry
you,
about
Barb.
that. I know that when I was in pilot training, and I was in the second class to go through for the Air Force, I got a letter from Barb and some of her other graduates asking whether I was interested in having an organization for the women military aviators, specifically the women pilot aviators. And Barb had been contacted the WASP. And then she basically spearheaded the formation of the organization with the WASP. And I didn't meet the WASP until after all that got put together, which was wonderful. Your turn. Back to you, Bo.
Well, this is a longer letter, but
So, Barb,
Sarah.
Barb, can you tell us
Sarah.
who contacted you to join the group?
Sarah Hayden, and she called me and she said, who are you? And I want to talk to you. That's the way she talks it, you know. And she talked that we should help us, the new people, and she says in this letter, we know how she was very stubborn. So they had a president, Sarah Hayden, vice president, Betty Nichols, secretary, and that's how we got together. And she started to tell me what we should do.
Okay, thank you. So they ran this organization for 2 or 3 years, then they invited us in, and they got a hold of Barb Broomy. Barb got an alpha roster from the Air Force with all the pilots, and it had nabs on it too. And they invited us to join, and that was about 1981. So then, our first conference was 1983, and we sat at the knees and we heard some more stories. Can we hear some more stories from folks?
Well, before you.
Can I just
Oh, go ahead.
put something in? When Barb got contacted initially, for whatever reason, I got contacted and asked, will you go out to the East Coast and meet with the WASP and have a discussion and explain to them who we are? And so I went out, sure enough, here was Sarah and Betty and these folks, and Sarah looked at me, same question, who are you? What are you about? And it really was one of their regional kind of conferences that they were getting together on. And they gave us all a hard look. They gave me a real hard look. The conversation, you know, why should we help you? Why are we going to get together? Are you all going to do right by the reputation of women aviators? So they weren't fooling around when they all got together. And I second Barb's position that Sarah, she was very, very keep everything in mind, make sure everything, all the I's were dotted, T's were crossed. And now Lucy, having taken over from Sarah, is very much the same way. Thank you, Lucy. There you go. It just lives on.
So in the at the first convention, Barb and the WASP were able to put together a convention for us to actually get together, the rest of us, to get together with the WASP. And our first convention was in 1983, and it was in Indianapolis, which is where Marcy was telling her story. And one of the premier things is these women, which it is kind of scary because we met them when they were our age. So, you know, we consider ourselves pretty lively. Well, they beat us hands down. The first introduction was we would go to the suite in the hotel, and they said, oh good, we're glad you're here. Come into the bathroom. And we're like, come into the bathroom? What is this about? Well, they had filled the bathtub full of ice, and in the filled bathtub full of ice were bottles of champagne. Okay, we're gonna get this party started. Here, let's have some champagne. And that was the rest of us, our introduction.
Champagne.
Good champagne, yes, exactly. And so that was our first meeting with them. And I'm not exactly sure, Barb might remember exactly how many folks came to the convention for the WMPA at that point, but we weren't very many in existence at that point in 1983. And the other thing that was pretty exciting was Barb can tell you a little bit about the T-38 flyover that they had, and they had to pull together from various bases in order to get enough women in those airplanes to have a four-ship. So Barb, can you tell us a little bit about your four-ship?
Well, I asked there were not enough women, and so I gathered them, and then I said my superior said I would like to take do a flyover in Indianapolis, and so he said, what with all women? And he says, what? And he said, what do you mean taking all, a group of, but he said, and then we had to go to Randolph, we had to do so much paperwork, and then my superior said, if anything goes wrong, just steal away. So they didn't want to do it. It was the first women flyover. That's it.
Okay, so we want to get to the stories we can tell about the WASP. So,
Okay.
so to start?
Okay, so I'll let Lucy tell a little bit about her communication with Sarah, but anyone who had been an officer over the years as a treasurer, you always had to work with Sarah because she was the clerk, and so that's the position that Lucy has taken over. So I'll let you tell Sarah's stories. One of my great connections was with Dawn Seymour, and she's right up there, the second one, large picture. She lived to be 100, and I had the pleasure of meeting her at different conventions and stuff. That was kind of the cool thing. The Women in Aviation International has an annual convention, and many of the WASPs would come. I always liked to work registration because I could see them when they came in, and it was always worth a million hugs every time they would come in to say hello. But Dawn and I ended up being in special 3 separate occasions. There's a memorial at Arlington Cemetery. It's Women in Military Services. And the dedication for that was in October of 1997, just after the first round of Gulf War. And they decided that they were gonna have a flyover. And of course they wanted to try to have all women crews. Only the Air Force was able to provide, and I flew heavy airplanes, C-141s, and Dawn actually was in the airplane with us the day that we got to fly. And there's a picture that we'll show you in our slideshow where she got to be with the crew. So it was so much fun to have her in the airplane with us. And then in 2005, the Museum of Flight in Seattle has a program every spring. It's called Women Fly. And Dawn and I were both able to be on that panel. So we got to tell our stories again and another opportunity to interact with each other. And then in March of 2010, many of you may remember that that was when the women were given their Congressional Gold Medal. And the way that service went, there's one gold medal that was given ceremoniously at the time when they did that dedication, but then they had military people paired up with the WASP so that you could present their very own gold medal to them. And I was fortunate enough, and I might have known somebody, but I was able to give Dawn her gold medal. So we had this bond that kind of went over the years. And I think for me, coming in 1981, I remember the WASP saying to us, no one is going to tell your story if you don't tell your story. And so that was their goal, to get us set up so that we certainly didn't belong in their organization. They were a finite group of women, and so that was what I learned, is how they kept us going. And then they just continued to mentor us and have these relations. It was a very mutual admiration society, because we were in awe of all the things that they did. I remember when they were so excited when the women flew the first 141 across the Atlantic Ocean. The rest of us are trying to keep our heads down. Okay, we just want to do our job. We want to, you didn't want to highlight anything. And I could not understand why they were so excited about it, why they wanted to make a big deal about it. Well, they had been denied that opportunity. They couldn't fly across the ocean. I mean, obviously they could, but by law they weren't able to. So when the new generation was able to do that, for them it was a big deal, and that kind of gave me a little bit more perspective as to why we should appreciate what we were doing as opposed to hiding behind what we were doing. So those are some of my stories.
So Sarah Hayden was our clerk until 2003.
Yes. Well, I started running into WASP at a lot of different events, different conventions, and 99 meetings, and I was so inspired by them because they flew like 40 different types of military aircraft, and here I was, a new Navy pilot flying, 2 or 3 kinds of aircraft. They flew pursuits in the war, which were the equivalent of fighters. And so I complimented them. I said, you actually led, forged a pathway for us, because the military knew that you all could fly those aircraft, and now we are getting to fly tactical jet aircraft and long-range tanker aircraft and operational aircraft. So I always gave them the feedback that they had helped us. So Sarah Hayden was in the last class of the WAP, W4410, and she was only operational for like 2 or 3 weeks, which was kind of sad when you think about it. But she was at Randolph, she got to do engine test runs, and she got to ferry airplanes from one side of the field to the other, and that was kind of it. But she was fiercely protective of the WASP legacy, and when I started visiting her in Massachusetts, when I moved to Massachusetts in 2000, her house was loaded with WASP memorabilia, and she guarded it like it was Fort Knox. She wouldn't let any of that stuff out of her house, but she did allow me to make copies of a lot of the original documentation that Barb was talking about when they started having meetings. One meeting was at her house. They had the convention in Indianapolis. She had all kinds of records, and she taught me, don't throw anything away. So I learned that. And so I made copies, sent it to Barb, and she was able to write more comprehensive history of our women military pilots organization. So Sarah was the clerk, and then I ended up taking over clerk from her. But the big contribution she made was when they got veteran status in 1977, there were 1,000 of them. So you had to do 1,000 plus applications to the Air Force to get veteran status, to get a DD-214, which is the record of military service. So I started visiting her in 2000 when I moved to Massachusetts. Her dining room table was covered with applications and pieces of information that had to be provided to the Air Force. She got so good at it, the Air Force personnel guys just said, okay, whatever, send in the application and it looks good to us and we'll get it through. She was like the expert in how to get the WASP their veteran status, which is huge. That enabled them to get a veteran grave marker, that enabled them to get veterans benefits. And in the 2000 timeframe, there were a lot of them still alive, so it made an impact. And they got their service medals for serving in the World War II timeframe. So anyway,
But I have
talking
to-
too long, I'm
I
sorry.
I have to tell on Sarah. So Sarah died at 99 years old, and her family and I have been in touch a long time because I know her son, who's my age, and he called me and he said, I can't find Mom's DD-214. She's been doing it for everybody else, but she did not do it for herself. So I had to call a 3-star general and say, I need help. And we got her a DD-214 so she could have military honors there.
Oh, my goodness.
So,
This is
so Trish, can you give us one of your war stories about a friend you have from a WASP?
War stories. Not all the war stories, but when I was an officer in the organization, I got to deal with Sarah Hayden quite a bit. And by no means was a horror story or a war story. She made sure that we did everything properly for the good of the organization and for the good of us, to make sure that we preserved our history correctly. And so sometimes I'd get a little frustrated, but I always knew where she was coming from. And so I always, kept that in mind and, made sure that I didn't let it get to me at all. I just knew that even though she might be a little stern about certain things, that she really was just trying to protect the organization and all of that. So that's probably the only, the biggest war story. I've gotten to know quite a few of the other WASP, and I have lilac trees planted in my yard here in Auburn, Washington from from Pearl Judd. I want to make sure I got the name correctly, that I didn't mess it up here on on this. So she was one of the last presidents of the WASP, organization. So, but just nothing but great things to say about them. How wonderful they were, how good they were to us in forming the organization for us and preserving it for us. That's all I'd have to say.
Thank you, Trish. Diana.
Uh-oh.
There I was. Where was I? I started meeting, well, I met the WASP in the early 90s, and I had a couple assignments or tours back in DC. And I got to know a couple of WASP there, Lorraine Rogers, Toby Felker, and Elaine Harmon. And when I retired in '99, I stayed there for a number of years. And I decided I was really going to get to know these women. Because it was one thing to go to the convention. So every other year they'd have a convention, every other year the women military aviators would have a convention, and we all went to everybody's convention. But I decided I'm going to go to each and every one of them, and they had this philosophy that they started early, went early, stayed late, and they didn't pack in a bunch of things into the convention because they were all about meeting up with their friends. And happy hour started early, so you couldn't have anything, before 2 or 3. So in '99, I retired, and I started inviting them to lunch. And Elaine Harmon was way up in Bethesda, which was probably about an hour drive. So we didn't meet up with her as often, but Toby Felker lived 2 miles away. So and Lorraine was 5 miles away. So I would go pick up Toby first for lunch, and then we'd drive out to Lorraine, and we would have 30 minutes in the car to convince. And then on the way back, I would drop off Toby first, and then Lorraine and I would have 30 minutes to convince. So over time, not only were they my mentors, but they became my friends. And especially after a couple glasses of wine, you would, because these lunches, Lorraine ate very slow. And the lunch might take 3 or 4 hours. And there was a couple glasses of wine there. And after, a few years, because they had this image of the WASP, the lipstick, the nice pressed everything. And everything was kind of, I don't want to say goody two-shoes, but let's get real. They were young women in the prime of life. They didn't do everything right. And after a couple glasses of wine, you started hearing some real good stories. One story that I'll tell, because I'll get the hook here if I don't. Lorraine told me that Lorraine and Toby were baymates. And I think there were 6 women in the bay. And her brother was coming to visit. And they didn't know where he was going to stay. But one of the baymates had to leave for the weekend. I think they left on Thursday. He came in on Thursday. So they dressed him up in her clothes. He slept in the barracks with them, went to all the classes. They didn't have to fly. And then she came back on Monday and he left Sunday night. So she had pictures of him dressed up all in, this woman's outfit and everything. They never got caught.
Well, they were men's flight suits, so.
Pardon?
They were men's flight suits.
That's true, that's true. He fit in all of those. So.
That's a good story. So I open it up to the floor. More
Uh-oh.
stories.
Well, Bee Haydu had an incredible scrapbook collection, and she used to bring it to our meetings. So Bee was a historian and did an incredible job of helping preserve the history of the WASP.
Yeah, at a convention we had in DC, we had, of course, happy hour.
Kelly here.
And,
I have a couple that I'd love to share.
okay, and Bee sent me, I said, Bee, what can I get you to drink? She says, 2 fingers of rye. And I said, what's rye? She says, what's rye? It says on the bottle, rye. I said, we don't have it. I'm sorry. We have bourbon, we have whiskey, we don't have rye. And she says, okay, give me, 2 fingers of bourbon. I was like, 2 fingers? I don't understand. There's an ounce, there's 2 ounces. And she says, put 2 fingers up to the glass, fill it up to there. Didn't your parents teach you anything?
Kelly, go ahead, Kelly. Kelly, go ahead.
All right. When I was living in, yes, okay, I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
Can you hear me all right? Okay. Yeah, because you guys are fading in and out, so that was a little difficult on our side. Okay. This is Adele Sharp. Some of you may or may not know her. She actually was at WASP, also ATA. And she lived about an hour from where I was, over I was in Illinois. And I went over to her house a couple times while she was still writing the book, Sisters in the Sky, which, by the way, with the WASP was a fairly controversial book, because I was told a lot of those stories were exactly right by numerous people. But the other thing that I found out in having lunch with her was that the folks that studied under Jacqueline Cochran and the folks that studied under Nancy Love did not see eye to eye. The two did not see eye to eye, and as a result, it became sometimes a bit tense. And the folks that went to the ATA to fly and then came back, that was, they weren't exactly taken in immediately. But Jackie and sorry, the missing of Love. Yeah, the two of them had different views on how the WASP were going to be handled and how things were, as we all know. But Adele was a really interesting person to talk to, and she was very fascinating. And I would go over there because she'd been over in England. For whatever reason, she decided the thing to do was to invite me to tea. And tea was like high tea that we have over in England, where we had little sandwiches, all like that. And then we'd sit and talk for 2 or 3 hours. And she was a pretty fascinating lady. And I enjoyed the book, but like I say, when I would mention it off and on to the other WASP would say, oh, those stories, some of them aren't exactly right. And I guess some of our memories aren't like that either. So there you have it. If I can do just one more, I'll do like that. These are my neighbors down in the Indianapolis area. That's basically, we've got Marty Wall, Esther Byrne, Betty Nicholas, and then also there was, Madge Bent, who is in the blue, second to the left, right behind you. Anyway, Madge Bent and her husband Sherman were a trip. I go down there and talk to them. She wanted to fly since she was about 4 years old. Her mom kept saying, you know, wait, your time will come, et cetera, et cetera. And it was the famous dollar ride that many of us are familiar with. I got dollar ride when I first started flying. It shows you how old I am. Anyway, the dollar ride she was telling me about, they had a barnstormer came in, offered a ride, said they give it to her for $1, and Mom said we can't afford $1. And she said later on when she was in school and they opened up the training for women that would actually be the WASP, she managed to get into that program and was thrilled. But her husband, the two of them were just a card. He was a herpetologist. And my husband and I went down to visit one day, and it was nothing like going into a house full of snakes and reptiles. And I mean, an entire basement of snakes and reptiles. And he was very well spoken. He and my husband got on really well. That's a good thing. And she would say to me, you and I will go upstairs and we'll talk shop while those boys sit down there with the snakes and go up back. But she loved being a WASP. The drawback for her was she had the opportunity to get together with Sherman before he went overseas. And she went to her, I believe it was B.J. Erickson, I think it was B.J. Erickson, who was her next up. And she went and requested visas on, got it granted, et cetera, you know where this is going, comes back 6-8 weeks later. She has to go in and say, I have to resign because I'm pregnant. And that was a big upset. But she said, when you guys talked about how long should we fly when we're pregnant and we have to, now we can fly and not have to get out. She said, it kind of wasn't an option for us back then. But she was always very involved in the WASP and with us in WMA, really great folks. And finally, Betty Nicholas, one of my favorite people in the universe. She and I got along real well. I'm sorry for tear. She and I got along real well, and I used to always go down to lunch and spend time with her. She was also one who liked a good shot of scotch or a good glass of wine. We'd sit and talk. But the thing that always lingered with me, and when I had to give her tribute, she had been a wing walker. And
Wow.
that always fascinated me, but that's how basically she got into flying, was initially as a wing walker before she ended up being a pilot. And I said, can't get much more upside down than that. It's an okay deal. But the WASP have just always been there for us, and they've been good friends, always good friends. They also were the ones who sent my care packages when I was over in Gulf. Them and the WMA folks made sure that I was good from cookies and other swell stuff, including nighttime slippers.
So at one of the conventions, I was on the bus with Betty Nichols. I was sitting next to her and she said, how you doing? And I had boy troubles. So I was explaining all the boy troubles. And she looked at me and she said, honey, they're not worth it. You keep on with your career and just don't pay any mind. So that's the kind of advice we were getting from these gals when we were meeting with them. Other stories?
I have a couple. Betty Nichols, and then we'll move on. We were at a convention and I had been the financial chair and I had to, I don't know, explain something and, you know, it didn't exactly go that, you know, great. Somebody was complaining or whatever and, you know, I was about to hit the roof. But anyhow, it went all right. And walking out, she came up and put her arm around my shoulder and she said, meet me in 30 minutes before we go to dinner. So I went up to her room. Betty kept a little flat mask. I don't know what was in it, but I got the bunch of stuff in my glass, and 2 fingers in my glass, and we sat there and solved the world's problems for another 30 minutes before we went down to, actually to dinner. But in '03, was the centennial celebration for the Wright brothers, and the WASP were invited. So I drove Elaine Harmon, Toby Felker, and Lorraine Rogers down. And it was a rainy weekend. It was awful, it was awful. And I had Gore-Tex shoes on, so I didn't get water in my shoes, but they did not. They were drowned rats. I had the high-tech material that, you know, I didn't get wet. They did. They were just swollen. But they didn't want to give up. They didn't want to quit. I said, why don't we go into the hangar and, you know, kind of hang out? All right, Diana, if you're cold, you go in the hangar. So finally, about mid-afternoon, we were way at the other end of the airfield. We had to walk all the way over to catch our bus, and we were all tired. And the WASP were in their uniform. And we're walking down kind of this back street, and Toby, she's kind of in the middle, and we see this bus coming. And Toby comes to the middle, and she stop! She walks over, so the guy opened up the door. Toby walks up, she stands in front of him and says, I'm Lieutenant Toby Felker. I'm commandeering this bus. Take us to our hotel. And she just stomped back and sat down. And I'm next up, and I go, is that all right with you? Sure, what hotel do you want? So I told him, and we got on, and we got escorted to the hotel. So the point here is from, you know, getting our brother into the barracks and everything, all the way up until they passed away, they had a spirit about them. And they passed, although we had to have a spirit, you know, just being aviators, but they helped guide us through our lives, not to give up, not to, screw up our careers, because we had things to do. And we also have things to do for the next generation coming up behind us. Just like they have something to do for the generation coming up behind them. So they were all about legacies.
And I think the one thing too that was important to know is when they went through training, you know, they were all together and they were all here. And when we went through, I mean, there were only 3 gals in my class of 60. And so they, for me, taught me that value of the camaraderie of the women, because we were, I don't know if it was divide and conquer, if that was the concept of the services when we went through, but you know, we were all onesies and twosies, and so to have that example of what that sisterhood could be and how to stick together, and oh yeah, you're trying to do your job and you want to be recognized. You never wanted someone to say, oh, you got this job because you're a girl. Well, that's not necessarily a compliment, right? But they also taught us how to appreciate the fact that we were women in this realm also. And I think for me, that's one of those things that really stuck with me all those years, to acknowledge the fact that, oh yeah, I am a girl doing this, you know, that kind of a thing. And to be able to share those experiences together.
Well, Margaret Ringenberg wrote a book called Girls Can't Be Pilots, because somebody told her that. She became a WASP. Margaret was from Indiana. She became an air racer, as a bunch of them did. And I raced one time, and I was like 40 years old. They were like 75 years old, and they kicked my ass. They were so shrewd, smart, good at planning their flight. It was a VFR air race, the all-female air race, which started out as a powder puff and became the Air Race Classic. So it was really cool to like match wits with these ladies, and they were just awesome, inspirational.
So we've done a little thinking, what is the legacy of the WASP for us? And they were all volunteers, they volunteered for duty. The all-volunteer force came in 1973, we all volunteered for duty. They flew every aircraft in the inventory, We did not. But we fought to get that for the second generation so they could fly every aircraft in the inventory, and that happened in 1993. They pushed the limits of flight, 38 died. Some of our ladies have died because they pushed the limits of flight. The aircraft controls cannot tell what gender is at that stick. It doesn't care. And we had to prove, again, to the military that we could do that. But we did it because they did it. And then after 1945, over 200 of them kept serving in the military and were in units with men. They couldn't fly, but they were in units with men, and they proved that men and women could serve together in a unit. We just heard that we were ones or twos in a unit. So I was the first in my squadron, and I was all by myself, and then I got the letter that the WASP had stood up this organization, had called Barb and said, we'll let you in, we'll let you join us. And I thought, what a great opportunity to start getting a little support because I was all by myself. So that's what the WASP did for us. And I'd asked Justin to put up the last slide. I had a set of slides, but it was too hard to maneuver with this. This is the last slide. This is Diana Davis's retirement. And it is 3 generations of aviators. We have a WASP, we have a second generation or third generation, and then that's me in the back. Because Diana wanted the flag folded by 3 generations of women aviators.
And I'll just say, just to give you another tidbit, that isn't a tie on Lorraine Rogers' blouse. She lost her tie somewhere when she got out of the car, and that's a sock. She took a sock off of a Navy guy and said, here, tie my tie. Proud as can be.
That's awesome.
So we have little cards about women military aviators. We changed the name after they started it with Women Military Pilots Association. Please contact us if you have questions that we might be able to answer. We do have archives at Texas Women's University. In those archives, in my archives, are letters from Sarah harassing me for not doing the clerk duty or the treasury report correctly. And then news, they send us Christmas letters too and talk about all of you. So please let us help you if you have questions that we may be able to answer. Thank
Very
you.
good.